Today is December 1st, 2019. If you all could please introduce yourselves.
I'm Archie Bolster.
I'm Ann Bolster.
Dad, you want to talk about your career background a little bit?
As my first post in the Foreign Service was Cambodia, and then I came back from Cambodia to the U.S. to go through training in Farsi for 10 months, the Persian language. And then we went out to Tabriz, which is our first post in Iran. And I was able to talk to anybody who knew Farsi.
What year was that?
1961. Unfortunately, there was a slight problem in that the people in Tabriz spoke Azerbaijani Turki, which was similar to Turkish of Istanbul, but just different enough that you had to be able to handle it. So when I met people, if they knew Farsi, if they'd been educated, they knew the language, so I could speak Farsi with them. But if they spoke only Turki, then it was more difficult to get across any ideas. And when I was in Tabriz, in Tehran, that second time, I was deputy to the political counselor. So I did a lot of interviews with Iranians.
Did you work at the embassy?
Yes, I was in the embassy.
So can you talk a little bit about your final tour? Just kind of the things you did, some things you might have noticed while there in Iran?
Well, we did notice from various people we talked to that a lot of people were making arrangements to move their assets out of Iran to the U.S. or France or wherever. So even though we were heavily invested in Iran and kept busy there, we did realize from the conversations we had with Iranian families that a lot of them were sensitive to the Shah gradually losing influence, and they would plan to leave the country before he departed.
Were these upper class families or were these more middle, lower class families?
These are upper class families.
Why was the Shah losing influence?
He wanted to be a modernizing monarch, and he, for example, he believed in women's liberation, wanted women to be without a chador covering, the head covering, and this was not uniformly popular. And some of the students began to wear chadors at Tehran University just to show that they were not followers of the Shah. So there were tensions like that.
Did you see these tensions continue to increase as you spent more time in Iran? Did they get more pronounced?
Yes, they definitely did, because the Shah wanted to be popular, but he also wanted to maintain his power. So in Tabriz, for example, there was a situation where he ordered his troops to fire on mobs that were attacking the airport and his statue. So that was a touchy situation. And when he had the troops fire, then of course, that stirred up anger with those who were killed. And in Iran, you have a 40th day after a person dies, you have a commemorative session. So a lot of Tabrizis came to that.
And during your time, did you increasingly see the Shah losing power, and were you as a U.S. diplomat reporting that back to the United States?
Well, we were definitely reporting back to Washington what the Shah was doing and his gradual loss of influence and power. But the U.S. government as an entity was constantly in favor of the Shah and wanted him to be tough and stay in power. So that was a problem.
What were the warning signs that you saw that the Shah was losing power, and did the government ignore the warning signs, do you think?
You might mention corruption in Savak.
Yes, there was a lot of corruption in the Iranian government, and so that was a situation where people were losing interest in the Shah.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Savak. People were afraid and hated Savak.
Yes, Savak was the secret police. It stands for Sazmane.
Doesn't matter.
Amniyat.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was an organization that kept track of the opponents of the Shah, and they would imprison people who spoke out against the Shah.
As you got further towards the revolution in your time in Iran, did you see the secret police arresting more people, or was there more of a threat to Iranian citizens from the secret police?
Yes, there were more people arrested and sent to prison. So that became a source of public anger toward the Shah.
And do you think that that might be one of the major factors that contributed to the revolution and to the hate of the Shah?
Yeah.
As a woman, as an American woman who spent time in Iran, I would like you just to talk a little bit about your experience as an American woman in Iran, and what the roles of women in Iran were. For example, like, did you feel any pressure as an American woman in Iran from the culture, from the religious culture, especially towards the revolution as it was getting more religious?
Well, I'd like to talk first about my time in Tabriz, Iran, because that was my introduction to Iran. And Tabriz is, as a much smaller city, is quite different than Tehran. My experience was that in my relationships with the upper class, and those were most of my social relationships, they were modernizing quite nicely, and they did not wear chadors. They were in general well educated, and they were very intelligent women. And I had another experience while I lived in Tabriz. I taught English to a university student, and I became very close with her. She was the daughter of a general, and she was extremely interesting to see the transition going on, because she did not wear a chador, but when she went out on the street, she wore a scarf over her head. She always kept her hair covered. She was extremely interested in learning about us as Americans. She was an excellent English student. While we were there, though, her parents arranged a marriage, so that was very old-fashioned. She did not complain in the least. The marriage was a good one, in that she was being married off to a doctor who was quite a few years older than she was, which was also just very, very common in Iranian society. I knew her parents too. They were lovely, hospitable people who entertained in the old-fashioned Iranian way with tea and Turkish coffee and lots of fruits and little sweets. And they wanted to meet me because they wanted to know where their daughter was going several times a week and whether I was an appropriate person for their daughter to know. And that was, to me, one of the highlights of living in Tabriz. But let me say, too, that going into the bazaar was quite a different experience, rather than dealing on a daily basis with ladies I met at parties, at teas, at bridge games, etc. These were the high-class Iranian ladies. But when I went to the bazaar, or when I went outside at all, I had to make sure that I was modestly covered, that my arms were covered. Most of the time I wore loose slacks, I wore a headscarf, and still, when I got to the bazaar, oftentimes young men would come up and kind of push against you or rub against you because they knew you were a foreign woman, and that they thought you were a loose woman because you were a foreign woman. So there was a big difference between the upper classes, even the middle classes, and the lower classes in Iran. And that was no different in Tehran. Anytime we were there 2 times. The way people dressed, the way people reacted towards foreigners was much different if you went to South Tehran, where the poorer people lived and where the huge bazaar was. You had to be very careful, and you didn't go alone as a woman. But I met some highly educated Iranian women in Tehran. One of my friends was a doctor, one was a school principal. Iranian women are highly intelligent. They are, the upper class women love high fashion. They are beautifully dressed, and I'm sure the upper class women really chafe at the bit under the current regime, and many of them, the upper class people, got out because they saw what was coming.
So you mentioned that you wore a headscarf.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel a lot of pressure to wear a headscarf? Could you have gone out outside of your house without one on?
I wouldn't have done it because I knew that I would be harassed if I did go without a headscarf.
So that was something that was very important, just to blend in and as a
Yes.
part of culture.
Well, I can never totally blend in. They always knew that I was a foreigner. They might not know I was American, but they knew I was a foreigner. But it showed that I was respecting their customs by wearing a headscarf.
Did any of your friends talk to you about, as the revolution was approaching, the changing culture, their concerns within society, and how it was changing for women?
I can't remember anything specific, but I can remember things that both my husband and I noticed that, and we felt really sad about, that the moneyed class would be fine for the most part. They could protect themselves. They had already sent many of their sons and daughters either to Europe or to the States to get an education and to get a toehold in another country, and they'd sent money out. It was the middle class that was the one that was really stuck, because they were trying to modernize, and many of them held jobs that required a certain education, but they weren't particularly moneyed. They still had to work hard to make a living, and they could not protect themselves the way the upper classes did. They were not pro-revolution, and they had sufficient education to know this was not going to be good for them, but they couldn't get out. It was mainly the lower classes who were pro-revolution.
With that, can you speak a little bit about how the political culture and how politics was related to the social classes in Iran? I know you spoke about seeing much of the pro-revolution in the lower classes, but was it there in the middle classes? Was the middle class predominantly neutral? What was going on?
And why was the lower class pro-revolution?
I think Arch can talk a little bit more about that, because he did a lot of traveling into the countryside, into the villages. I did some of that when we lived in Tabriz, but I didn't do much of it when we lived in Tehran. And I think, well, I have my opinions, but I think Arch could speak to that a little bit better than I could, because you were involved in land reform when you were in Tabriz, and I think that has a certain bearing on some of this too, doesn't it?
Yeah. In fact, I was the first embassy officer to go and interview some of the people who were going through land reform. And the idea was to take excess villages from people who owned them and give them to the peasants who were farming the land. And that was a very new situation. And in fact, I went down to Maragay, which was a village where land reform started, and I used to interview a lot of the peasants who got land, and they were very excited about having the land that they farmed, given to them. And the Shah came up on the anniversary of land reform and gave deeds to land to the peasants. And they would come up to him and kiss his feet, and then he would lift them up and hand them the deed. And they were very excited about getting their own land. So it was quite a revolution taking place.
Yet, were they the same class that were part of sparking the revolution against the Shah?
Well, no, I don't think they would be against the Shah. They were still appreciative of having gotten the land.
But they were quite religious.
Yeah. The peasants were very religious, and so they didn't support the Shah and his lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So fundamentally, was it an uprising of religion that
Yes.
truly was the revolution, the core of the revolution?
Yes.
And how do you feel it gained so much momentum?
Well, it's hard to say, because some of the peasants were doing well with the land that they had given to them, and they were able to sell surplus agricultural products. But eventually that caused problems, because people in Tehran who had been used to getting food from their lands suddenly didn't have that, and so it caused a reduction in the amount of grain that was produced in the country.
Can you speak a little bit about the warning signs that you saw that were leading up to the revolution? What?
In your interviews and things that
Yeah.
you were talking to people about?
Yeah, we definitely, as I said before, we met people socially, and a lot of times they would give information about how they were transferring their assets overseas. Some of them bought land in the U.S., for example, so that when the revolution was coming closer, they would be able to get out of the country and go live on that land in the U.S.
So would you say that the revolution was inevitable? That it was bound to happen?
I think so.
The deep ingrained religious aspects of the country just
Yeah.
I think we knew people in the middle and upper classes who were not particularly pro-Shah, but they didn't expect the pendulum to swing as far as it did. They very much wanted to see the Shah gone, but they didn't want to see a religious government and take its place, because in general we found that certainly the upper classes were not particularly religious. They were pretty worldly. The middle classes, some of them were more traditional, but they were still trying to make the changes into a more modern society, whereas the lower classes, they only knew what they knew. They'd known for generations, and their religion was a comfort to them. and they could not imagine that it would be bad for them to have a religious government.
Talk a little bit about the actual revolution, and did you have communication with colleagues at the embassy at all? Did you get any feedback when it was happening? And you know, I know you had some sort of relationship with the prime minister, and
Well, of course, I was out of the country when,
right,
when it happened. We had left in '76, and the revolution happened in '79, so 3 years before. But I was in Antwerp, Belgium when it happened, and I was getting feedback from people coming out from Iran. They wanted to get to the U.S., and there were no embassy facilities to give them visas, so they would try to go to any consulate and get a visa to go to the U.S. And we had instructions not to give them visas. In fact, we only gave visas to the Baha'is who were persecuted in Iran, and that was the basis on which we were giving them assistance to come to the U.S. So I also had a friend who had been in Iran at the time I was there, and he got out and came up to visit me in Antwerp.
Describe how he got out. That was interesting because after the revolution happened, anybody who wanted to get out often had to disguise themselves, often go, into Turkey to get out. So tell how your friend got out.
Well, this fellow had a brother who was resident in Paris, so he got in touch with his brother, and the brother got in touch with people in Europe and got a passport issued in Spain for him. And he prepared a cover story that he'd been out of the country, and that's why he didn't speak Farsi, because he was coming back after long years out, coming back to the home country. So he managed to get out to the airport, and he thought he was okay. And then someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Sir, the line for foreigners is over there." So he quickly changed into that line and got his passport stamped and went out to the airport, onto the plane. And it was very exciting to him when the plane took off
Well, he
and left Iranian airspace.
He disguised himself a bit too by a mustache. I'd forgotten whether he had a goatee as well, but he looked quite different in the passport picture than we had known him to look. He did look like, he didn't look Iranian.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people, when they found that the new government was going after people who were speaking out against it, people who had been in former Shah's government, people who were journalists, they often ended up in prison and sometimes never heard of again. And so that's when many of them got out under very difficult circumstances.
Can you talk a little bit about the hostage crisis and what your reaction to the hostage crisis was while it was happening?
Well, of course, we were very much disturbed by the hostage crisis because these people were suddenly just captured and held in the embassy by Iranian students, and they threatened execution of some of the people to the point of bringing them down in the basement of the embassy and putting a gun to their head and then clicking, and there wasn't a cartridge in the gun, so it was very, very stressful for those people.
Did you know any of the hostages?
Oh yes, I knew a lot of them.
And met another one who moved in next door to us. So we became very good friends with him and his wife, who was Iranian Kurdish. And but we did know some who had served in Tabriz, not at the same time we did, but later on. Yes, definitely, it was a very, very scary time. And I recommend a book to read that reads like fiction, but it is nonfiction. It's called Guests of the Ayatollah, and it's about the Iranian hostage crisis.
So, Dad, it came a little bit full circle for you many years later. Do you want to talk about how you got contacted to be part of the U.S. Iran Claims Tribunal and what you did for the U.S. Iran Claims Tribunal?
Yeah, well, there were claims by Iran against the U.S. and vice versa, U.S. against Iran. So they established this tribunal in Tehran, in The Hague, and they needed somebody who spoke Farsi to verify some of the translations. So I agreed to go there for a couple of years, and I would be brought in, for example, to tell one of the American judges what a certain word meant in a declaration, how it was translated.
What was the nature of some of these claims against each other, these countries claiming?
Well, it was agreed that in the final settlement that got the hostages released, that there would be no claims made by the hostages themselves.
Because the Shah wanted all kinds of military equipment, and he had gotten military equipment and planes from the U.S. There were some things that were still in the United States, were there not? And the Iranians claimed
Yes.
that they paid for them and hadn't gotten them. That's one thing I remember.
Yeah, the Iranians had paid into a fund that was kept in an interest-bearing account in the Pentagon, and as things were produced, they were sent over to Iran. But then when the hostage crisis occurred, everything was frozen in place, and so these items could not be delivered, so they were often taken into the U.S.
Interesting.
Okay, I think we should talk about the two assassinations that occurred while we were in Iran the last time, even though this was 3 years before the Shah was deposed. Things were getting pretty dicey, and we didn't always feel safe. For instance, Archie used to be driven to work every day because we lived kind of on the side of the mountain, and the embassy was in the kind of a bowl in the middle of Tehran. So it took about maybe 20, 25 minutes to go from our house to the embassy. He was driven on a different route every day in a car with bulletproof glass, and an Iranian plainclothesman, armed Iranian plainclothesman in the car. So that tells you things were not so sanguine
Yeah.
in Iran then. A couple of blocks from our home, wasn't it 2 military officers were assassinated? American military officers.
They were picked up at their home, and they started back down toward Tehran. They were blocked in by a car in front and a car behind, and then the assassins got out and killed these 2 guys in the back seat of the car.
Specifically targeting Americans at this
Yes.
point
Yes.
Yeah.
because of the American support of the Shah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then tell about the consulate assassination. There was an American embassy and there's an American consulate. The consulate, of course, is where visas are given. And you can continue with the what happened, because the wrong person was shot in that case.
Yeah. Well, the passports were kept overnight at the embassy, and then in the morning they were delivered over to the consulate to have the visas issued and then brought back over to the embassy. And on a particular day, the guy who was bringing the passports was killed because the terrorists had come to the back door of the embassy, and they knew that when the vehicle came out, they would have all these passports which they wanted. So they killed this guy in the back seat of the car, not knowing that he was their man. So it was pretty dangerous time.
Did you specifically ask to be transferred out, or was your tour just up and you
Our
didn't?
tour was just up.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing that we, even as dependents of the actual embassy workers, were told to keep our eyes out for anything unusual, for cars, unusual looking cars that, were on the street in front of our houses, perhaps observing our comings and goings. And one day I walked out of our gated yard to go to the shop on the corner, and I saw this car with 2 men sitting in it that was not a car of the neighborhood. And I probably did a pretty stupid thing, but I went up and I held my hand like this, pretending I had a paper in my hand and a pen, and I looked at their license plate and pretended like I was writing the number of the license plate, and they just peeled rubber and left, and I never saw them again. I don't know whether they were up to mischief, but they could have been. When you all went to school on a school bus, because your school was quite a distance from our home, I worried about you a little bit, because you sometimes had street children yelling at you. They knew it was an American school bus, sometimes throwing rocks at the school bus. So,
And that was just three years before the revolution.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a fairly stressful time. It really
Yeah.
was.
In that early.
Could you just really quickly before we finish up talk about your observations and your impressions of the Shah? Because you had met with the Shah on one occasion, right?
And the Prime
And the
Minister.
Prime Minister.
Well, the Shah was a study in contrast because he felt that he should be leading a democratic country, and yet he also wanted to make sure he stayed in power. So these are always in conflict. He would, for example, meet embassy officers once a year at a salam, so-called, where we all came with our ambassador and we went up one by one and shook his hand. But other times, he was very much opposed to uprisings by his people and wanted to put them down and maintain himself in power. So there was a constant byplay between his democratic ideals and his actual situation that he wanted to stay in power.
I think that one of the biggest contrasts that made a lot of people turn against him and even somewhat make fun of him was his coronation. Can you talk a little bit about his coronation?
Well, the coronation took place down outside of Persepolis, and that was after we left, but it was catered by a restaurant from Paris, and all these tents were erected there. It was a great tamasha, as they used to say, a great demonstration or whatever. And years later, those tents were still there.
It was for thousands of people and millions of reals, millions, probably billions, was spent on his coronation. It was a very extravagant affair in a country where the money could have been spent for much better things to help his people. And so he got a lot of criticism for that.
Before we go, I would like to ask each of you one last question, and I would like it if you would just share one example of a lesson you learned during your time in Iran, whether that be about culture, politics, anything really. It doesn't even have to apply to your everyday life, but just one thing you learned and took away from your time there.
Or for Dad, one thing the U.S. government should have done dramatically differently.
Well, the U.S. government should have changed their view of the Shah much earlier, because very late in the game they were still trying to get the Shah to stand up and be counted, and be firm and stay in power. At a time when the power was already drifting away, because you had Khomeini there outside of Paris making arrangements to come back, and so there was no way that the Shah was going to stay in power.
Yeah. Mom, any last thoughts?
Yes, I always, even though it was a very difficult posting for us personally as a family in many ways, I always liked Tabriz better than Tehran. I always felt that while some of the relationships with people could be a little difficult in a place like Tabriz. I was seeing more the real Iran in Tabriz than I was seeing it in Tehran, because Tehran is a huge, huge city, and we mainly, because of my husband's job, we spent a lot of time going to receptions and parties and meeting the upper class. I felt in Tabriz I was seeing more what Iran outside of Tehran was like, and I got to travel more, for instance, into the Kurdish area when we were in Tabriz. So in general, I always liked the smaller cities in Iran. I loved Isfahan, I loved Shiraz. They were beautiful, beautiful cities. Tehran was a combination of old and trying to be new. And it was polluted, and I just never liked it as much as I liked the rest of the country. So
Thank you so much. Thank you
You're
very
welcome.
much.
This was a really great
Yeah.
insight, and we appreciate your time for sure.